Oh, can everyone hear me? On Zoom, can you hear me? Perfect, okay, great. So my name is Alan Sachs. I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us for this very timely program here in person, a lot of folks on Zoom, which is great. Just by way of background, earlier this year, a small group of us here at OSE formed what I've been calling a J Street interest group. We've met a few times so far, not to endorse any specific J Street policies, but really just to create a space in our community for folks who have interests and questions about Israel and Palestine, and to learn more about J Street's perspectives and advocacy work. So this is our first attempt at hosting an open discussion, anything like this, and I want to thank all of you very much for your interest, your participation, and especially your patience with me as I try to moderate this. From a personal standpoint, my first engagement with J Street was at last year's national conference. As I've already shared with some of you, I returned to the United States after 7 years of living in Israel with what I would describe as a complicated relationship with that country. And in part because of that, I was finding it difficult to figure out where I fit myself in sort of established American Jewish communal life. For me, and I think for many American Jews, the rightward lurch in Israel that has in many ways reflected and even aligned with similar trends here in the United States has made us, many of us, uncomfortable. And for those of us who value democracy and civil rights and equal protection under the law, and who are so opposed to forces that seek to undermine these values here in the United States, elsewhere around the world, I think it sometimes becomes very difficult, for me personally, very painful, to reflect on what's actually happening on the ground in Israel and Palestine. This comes to a head, for example, when certain major pro-Israel organizations endorse dozens of members of our Congress who refused to certify the last election. So, for me personally, the opportunity to attend last year's J Street conference was actually hugely inspiring for me. To be in a space with thousands of other American Jews who share my core values, who want the United States and Israel both to live democratic values and work toward a peaceful resolution of the conflict in which Israelis and Palestinians both can live free and full lives, where human rights are protected and respected, without occupation and without fear. In J Street, I felt that I had found sort of a communal home for myself, where I could align my core political values also with my identity as both a Jew and as an American. So, with that introduction, I want to quickly mention that for anyone who might be considering attending this year's national conference, it's going to be a hybrid event in DC, December 3rd to December 6th. And Jamie Raskin is going to be headlining the opening night, which is really exciting. J Street is providing us here at OSE with a 20% discount code, which is OSE Shalom 2022 with no spaces. If you're interested in attending, if you have questions, if you want to talk to me more about J Street, about the conference, about tonight's program, about anything, you can reach out at any time. So with that, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Laura Birnbaum, J Street National Political Director. Laura joined J Street in 2019 after working on various political campaigns, most recently as the finance director on an Ohio congressional race. Laura graduated from the University of Chicago with a degree in public policy and lives in Washington, D.C. Some final housekeeping just before we begin. Laura's going to address a few issues and questions about trends that she's been observing in the midterms, and then we're going to open up the floor for what I hope will be some really robust Q&A and discussion. I think we may, well, what I would ask is that for those of you on Zoom, to please enter your comments and questions in the chat, and we will be sure to address them as they come up. And do you want to try to do introductions? Okay. And if maybe we will try to let folks unmute on Zoom also, so that you can ask questions directly. But definitely use the chat so we can keep track of questions as they come up. Okay, so without further ado, Laura, thank you.
Well, I want to thank Alan so much for having me tonight and for all of you coming out on a rather dreary Sunday evening, and for everybody on Zoom, getting on Zoom at 7 p.m. on a Sunday, which I also really admire. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. Obviously, I care deeply about our politics, and so I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you. I think what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about J Street's political work this cycle, just as some background, because I know there are some folks who aren't as familiar with J Street, and then I'll give a quick election overview, but mostly we want to spend the time on questions, and because we do have a smaller group both here and online, my goal is not to talk at you and tell you what I think, though I'm happy to answer, but really because these are issues that we grapple with, to have a conversation, and I'd love to hear where you all are as well. If you're online and you feel up to it, I'd love to see your face. I totally understand that that can be tiring sometimes, just the Zoom fatigue, but if you're available, we'd love to see you. And I think that's it for my housekeeping. So I'll just say very quickly about J Street, which Alan did such a good job covering it already, but J Street really is an advocacy organization that works primarily in American politics, but we have a policy goal. And the way that we think about ourselves and the way we talk about ourselves is that we are pro-Israel and pro-peace, and those things are necessarily interlocked. We are people who love Israel, who care deeply about Israel's safety and security, but have a complicated relationship and are opposed to some of the policies of the Israeli government, are very concerned with, again, the rightward lurch of the government, but also the ongoing forces that are entrenching the occupation in the West Bank. And, we're seeing cycles of violence that don't end, and we know that the only way for Israel to be safe and secure long term and to be democratic is for there to be two states. And to get there to that policy goal, that requires the U.S. putting a little bit more pressure on both the Israelis and the Palestinians than we've necessarily seen in the past. So that is the outcome that we hope to achieve on the ground. But the primary way that we do it is by working in American politics, because we strongly believe that one of the major constraints that we've had is political, that you can't have policymakers and lawmakers pushing for these kinds of tough and complicated policies if they feel too afraid to say something, if they feel like they don't have the political support at their backs. And I think we all know how it can be when there's a really complicated policy issue that is just, you're only getting snapshots or one-liners in the political space that are taking it totally out of context. And obviously this happens a lot with Israel. And so we are seeking to create that political space so that, the vast majority of reasonable folks can say, hey, let's have a tough conversation about how to make sure we get to peace in the region. That's our goal. We've been doing that for about 15 years. We, at this point, we have about 175 endorsed candidates. We support over half of the Democrats in both the House and the Senate. So that includes folks who are in leadership and a little bit more to the moderate side of the party: Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, Jerry Nadler, all J Street endorsees, and folks who are a little bit more on the left flank of the party: a Jamie Raskin, a Jamal Bowman. So it's a very big tent, which we really strongly believe in and think is really important for the movement. We've raised about $9 million for our candidates this election cycle. That's about what we raised last cycle. We also endorsed Joe Biden in the past. So we really consider ourselves, the common sense place for most Democrats to be politically and policy-wise on Israel issues. We try to work with members of Congress and their staff extensively from the day they announce they're running for office to when they get there, to help them learn, because these issues are new, to connect them with J Street leaders across the country, and generally just to help move the conversation forward and have them feel like there's a way to think through these complicated issues and really work out some tough values of their own. So that's essentially what we do and how we operate. I'm happy to answer more questions if folks have, but I am going to just kind of turn to the reason we're here tonight, which is U.S. political elections. So the midterms are 2 weeks away, which is very scary because, to me, I've been working on this for the last 2 years, and we're very close right now. This is going to be a very competitive midterm election. I think we all know this. Just to kind of quickly run through some of the facts of how we got where we are. Democrats hold really narrow majorities in both the House and the Senate. The president's party tends to lose seats in a midterm. That's kind of a historical trend for the last century. So this is going to be really, it's going to be really challenging and really competitive. And the reason we got here is, a couple of months ago in the summer, there seemed to be a little bit more momentum in favor of the Democratic Party. The Biden administration had passed really signature legislation. Biden's approval ratings were up. Gas prices, which were at a high in June, had come down. Democratic candidates, especially on the Senate side, were just doing really well and really running really good campaigns, and the Republicans were pretty consistently making fools of themselves. So it seemed for a little bit like there was good momentum on the Democratic side, that then we might see, a bit of a deviation from the historical trend. And now that we're 2 weeks out, we can see that the race has tightened once again. This is, again, very common for polls to get tighter, for margins to get tighter, for things to just really be competitive over the final stretch. And so I'll just kind of quickly outline what the political map looks like this cycle. Is on the Senate side, there's about 8 reasonably competitive races. Democrats are playing defense on 4 and have potential pickup opportunities on 4, and I'm happy to answer more questions about any of them. On the House side, we just came out this cycle of a redistricting year, which was very delayed and complicated because of the difficulty getting census results due to COVID. And there were a lot of interesting things that happened in the redistricting process this cycle, but one major piece of it is the very strong increase in severely partisan gerrymandering. And what that results in is more districts that are, say, D+30 or R+30. They're not really competitive in a general election. And so that both increases, extremeness on both sides and in Congress, but it also shifts all of the conversations that parties are grappling with on their issues to the primary election instead of the general election. And so we definitely saw Israel come up a few times in some notable primary elections this cycle. So that is my 30,000-foot view of what we're heading into. It's going to be a really competitive election. There's a lot of really important voices that we want to keep in Congress. And there are, real challenges that we face with, attacks, with the number of election deniers running for office, with the attacks on our election institutions. So there's a lot to pay attention to and be concerned about, and it's going to be very, very close. So I know that I just covered quite a lot, so I'll stop there, and I think Alan has a couple of questions first, but then happy to answer any questions that folks have or elaborate on anything else that I said.
Great. Thank you, Laura. So let's dive in. How have Israel and Palestine issues come up in this election cycle? And are these issues that you're seeing the American Jewish community seems to be focused on or responding to?
So J Street does polling of the American Jewish community every election night. We do exit polling. And what we have seen very consistently over the last 15 years is that American Jews very consistently vote for Democrats, about 75%, and that Israel is not a voting issue for most people. It usually ranks 12 out of 14. American Jews tend to vote on healthcare, education, COVID, guns, all of the regular domestic issues that the rest of us vote on. So Israel is actually not a motivating issue for many people in when they're deciding to cast their vote. This is what our polling says. You might say differently. You might say, I vote on Israel, and that's fine, and it's a free country, and we're all entitled to our opinions. But pretty consistently, that is what we see reflected in our polling. However, there is, a really outsized presence of Israel groups in the political space who make it seem like Israel is a very, very, very important voting issue. And this became very noticeable this cycle with the entrance of AIPAC into political spending and election and campaigns in a way that they hadn't necessarily been involved before. I heard that I'll address Emily's question in a second as we go. So AIPAC obviously has been around and a major political force for many decades. In less than a year ago, they launched a PAC and a super PAC for the first time and started spending money that really nobody could hope to keep up with in any field in primary elections this cycle. And so this is getting back to what I said before about conversations moving into the primaries. And so we saw a couple of very notable Democratic primary elections, one right here with Donna Edwards and Glenn Ivey, one in Michigan with Andy Levin and Haley Stevens, and a few others where there was a ton of money being spent by pro-Israel groups in the name of being pro-Israel on behalf of one candidate or another that made the outcome of the election seem like a referendum on Israel, though I find it hard to believe that any of the voters were voting on that specific issue. There's many other factors, but that is what the national narrative seemed to be. And so what we saw is, so this is a new trend that's very interesting, and I would love to get your thoughts on it, but we have seen both a couple of things come out of the AIPAC spending. One, a fear among Democrats who maybe hadn't been afraid or maybe haven't even felt out how they feel about Israel-Palestine issues, that they don't want to say anything about Israel publicly ever because they don't want AIPAC to spend millions of dollars in their tiny little primary and blow the race up to national proportion and brand them as something as not pro-Israel enough or anti-Israel. And these are people who tend to be younger, more progressive candidates of color, but not always. And a lot of them are just very unfamiliar with these issues and, again, don't have their policy views fully fleshed out, haven't maybe said anything publicly, and all of a sudden they're so afraid of being seen in a certain way or having their election, which is just like a little primary in some random state that no one's heard of, become the national spotlight. And so that's a real fear. And how we really see this impacting our work, because there are, it prevents the kind of hard conversations that members of Congress need to be able to have if they're so afraid to say anything publicly or privately. So that was one trend that we saw, and that's very new and notable. But what I will say about it is the near aligning of the far rights again. AIPAC, I think, over the last couple of years has really taken a turn to aligning much more closely with the far right elements of the Republican Party in the U.S. And a far right government in Israel, which we've had in the past and we might have again in a week. We don't know. And that alliance, I think, is very concerning for all of us who care about little d democratic norms in the US and in Israel. And so having AIPAC endorse and raise money for over 100 federal candidates who voted against certification of the election, the foundation of the US-Israel relationship is our shared democratic values. If you are not defending them here at home, how can you say, what are you standing for? And how can you say this is really the source of the US-Israel relationship? And so that's really concerning to us. I think it's concerning to all of us that anybody would be supporting election deniers. But that particular part is very concerning to us as people who care about Israel for this specific reason. So it's been really interesting to see AIPAC spend a lot of money on behalf of election deniers and against certain kinds of Democrats who are perceived as being anti-Israel despite having not necessarily said or done anything to that effect. So that has been a new change in this election cycle that will have serious policy repercussions. And I think the question for our movement, for those of us who care about having a different set of voices in Washington, not shutting down the political conversation on Israel, and also just think that the amount of money is like really unbelievable, and that shouldn't be who decides who wins a primary. I think there's a real question about what does a broader movement look like for us to address how much money is being spent and on what issues, and where can we go from there. And I know Emily asked a question about this in the chat about AIPAC giving money to Glenn Ivey. Yes, thank you, Mark, for the clarification. I also will just say, full disclosure, J Street was involved in this race. We did give a lot of money to Donna Edwards, and we did spend independent expenditures for her as well. And what that means is independent expenditures are basically a way to get around campaign finance laws. It means that any of us with our free speech citizen or corporate hats on can say, oh, I really love this candidate and I want all my friends to vote for them. And so I'm going to spend a few $1 million and run ads for them. And as long as you don't talk to the campaign and tell them what you're doing, you're technically not working with the campaign or for them. So you're just like a private citizen spending money. And so then you can spend as much as you want. So that's how people get around campaign finance laws. And it has become, over the last few years, like the dominant way that money is spent in politics and the number one way that messaging happens. So AIPAC does this through their super PAC, which is called the United Democracy Project. We also have a super PAC, the J Street Action Fund. And so we spend some money for Donna Edwards. They spent a lot of money for Glenn Ivey. So legally, he couldn't have refused the money because they weren't working together explicitly. But something that happened last cycle is that's worth pointing to is what he could have done was he could have denounced the ads. He could have said, I don't think these ads are in good faith. I don't want them to be run and associated with me. In the Eliot Engel Jamal Bowman primary in the Bronx last year, which folks might remember, Eliot Engel was unseated by Jamal Bowman, who was a principal in the Bronx. There was an outside group that was spending a lot of independent expenditures on behalf of Eliot Engel, and the attack ads they were running were kind of racist against Jamal Bowman, and Engel actually said publicly, take these down, I don't want to be associated with them, even though he didn't know about them. So that really would have been the only thing that Glenn Ivey could have done. And I think, yes, go ahead.
So I apologize. I may have missed this. You may have already said this. You said that you work with candidates from the beginning when they start to run. You start with the education. And I wondered in the Republican primaries, did J Street work in some of those Republican primaries pushing? And if you already said this, I missed it.
No, I didn't, so thank you for the clarification. So J Street is a nonpartisan organization, which is worth me saying out loud because it definitely doesn't come across in how I'm talking about politics. The last time we endorsed Republicans was 2014, in the vein more of the libertarian bent, but folks who were really aligned with us on Israel policy. After the Iran deal, the JCPOA in 2015, there was a real partisan break over Israel issues that has only been exacerbated over the last few years. And so we are now in a place where, while there are some Republicans who we talk to behind closed doors on Capitol Hill, and we have working relationships with their office, there's no Republican who would take our endorsement or whom we would feel comfortable publicly endorsing, again, just because of how partisan the issue has become, which we don't want. I think all of us probably agree that the U.S.-Israel relationship would be bettered if support for Israel was bipartisan, and a lot of the legislative vehicles that we work on will be bipartisan. That is just very challenging to do in this political environment, and that's happening on every issue, not just this one. So we work with some Republicans behind closed doors. We don't endorse any at this moment. If you're the kind of person who believes in a post-Trump Republican Party, we will in the future. I don't know that I necessarily believe in that, but we've all been surprised in politics before, so maybe we'll be surprised again.
Donna Edwards had a lot of problems as a candidate, and I don't think the issue of J Street or AIPAC really affected the election. She has a lot of issues, very bad on supporting her people. So I just want to make sure people understand that really the money that AIPAC and J Street may put into that election probably didn't affect. I don't believe it affected who won.
As long as Donna Edwards' name came to the surface, could you tell me a little bit more about J Street's apparent endorsement of Donna Edwards? It seemed to me that Glenn Ivey was much more supportive in general of Israel than Edwards was.
Yeah, I'm happy to address both of those. So one, thank you. I think that point is well made because I tend to agree as well. When I was hearing from folks living in the district, every campaign is local, everybody's personal issues. It did seem pretty clear to us, both during and after, that Donna had a lot of problems with her campaign, and the reason she lost was not because of her record on Israel, but because of other issues. The reason J Street endorsed her was because when she was in Congress the first time, she was endorsed by J Street, and she was one of the first members of Congress to come out in vocal and public support of the Iran deal in 2015, which was very important to us as a diplomatic solution that successfully constrained Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon. The Iran deal, if I just take a minute to say a few words about this, is one of the rare examples in foreign policy where you get almost like a perfect science experiment, which is there were a lot of people who believed at the time that it wouldn't work, that Iran couldn't be trusted, that they would be developing nuclear material anyway. But under the deal, we had regular intensive international inspections, and we knew that Iran's breakout time was, a few years. And since Trump pulled out of the deal unilaterally in 2018, we don't have that oversight. And we know that Iran's breakout time is down to a few weeks. And this is something that, if this is the kind of news that you follow, you'll see over the last year and a half, there's been every 6 weeks, Iran crossed this milestone and they're this much closer to a nuclear deal. And obviously, none of us want Iran to have nuclear weapons, both because of the threat to Israel and the region, but also with what we're seeing and how they're giving weapons now to Russia to aid in the war against Ukraine. Iran is a very scary, bad actor, and the idea of them having nuclear weapons is really, really, really dangerous, and it's definitely not something that we want to trust them with. And we also really don't want to go to war with them. So it would be ideal if we could take the nuclear option off the table through diplomacy, and either use that to build upon that to address some of the other issues, or just just take that issue off the table. And so the Iran deal did work, and I think was a great foreign policy success that unfortunately the Trump administration really damaged. And I think, the Biden administration had been trying to get back into the deal, and it hasn't happened. And I frankly don't know that it will. And so there's very real, damage caused by that. But all that is to say, to go back to 2015, at the time that the deal was being, debated, politicians were really split. They didn't know if it would work, and also they didn't know how politically risky it would be to say, well, I think we should make a deal with Iran. J Street believes that it was very important, and Donna was one of the first people to come out in support of the deal, which, as I said, did end up working. And we also saw that no one who voted for the deal in 2015 lost re-election in 2016. So again, not a voting issue, not politically toxic to say this was a good deal. So we wanted to reward that and our past relationship with her. So that was how we ended up endorsing her in the primary, which I see that Seth asks as well. And so that was how that specific race was decided. I think, I don't know how you folks all feel about this race, though I'm gathering some sense. I think that every campaign is local. I think if we were making this decision again, we probably wouldn't make it this way. So I hope that clarifies. And then I'll address, I don't want to forget Linda's question up top, but I'll just say for John really quickly, does it surprise J Street that Israel is a low-ranking issue? I don't think so. This has never been something that surprised me. I mean, my grandma votes purely based on Israel, but that's okay. She's one person. I think for all of us, and for many of us who are politically engaged, one, Americans in general don't tend to vote on foreign policy broadly, even though it really matters, and it really matters who's in office for these kind of presidential, who's in Congress and in the White House for our foreign policy. It's not something that really moves voters, whether it's, how we pulled out of Afghanistan or the war in Ukraine. People just really don't vote on foreign policy. And it tends to be, the same bread and butter domestic issues that people vote on. How are they feeling about the economy? How are they feeling about crime? We know all these things. And so I don't think Jewish voters are exempt from exempt from caring about all the other things that all of us as citizens care about. So it's not something that surprises me, although I think what you're getting at, John, is there are voices within the American Jewish community who care a lot about Israel and do vote based on it, and they are very, very, very loud. And so to lawmakers and to the media and the news, it can seem like, oh, this is the voice that is representative of where the American Jewish community is. But it tends to be that those are the folks where Israel is like issues number 1, 2, and 3. And they're the ones who are talking about it all the time and calling their members of Congress. And for the rest of us who care about Israel a lot, but also care about other things, maybe we're not calling Congress about it every single day. And so they have a misrepresentation of where the American Jewish community is. And so I know I've been talking a lot, I'm sorry, but I just want to address Linda's question specifically, which is what does it mean to be pro-Israel or anti-Israel? And I think that this is really the core of what J Street's message is. There are folks in, I'll say AIPAC as an example, in other American Jewish groups who would say the definition of being pro-Israel is somebody who loves Israel so much that they will never say no to anything Israel asks for. They will cut the Israeli government a blank check for anything they need, either financially or politicized. They won't ever criticize them because that would somehow threaten the relationship or make Israel less secure. At J Street, we don't believe that. We believe that being pro-Israel means that we love Israel and we care deeply about Israel's fundamental founding values, which are to be a Jewish homeland and to be a democratic state. And the only way for Israel to be a Jewish and democratic state is for there to be a two-state solution, because either then Israel would take all of the West Bank and there would be kind of one majority Jewish state where half the citizens wouldn't have equal rights. That wouldn't be a democracy. Or there could be one state in the same area that's not majority Jewish and everybody has equal voting rights, but that wouldn't be a Jewish state. So the only way for Israel to remain Jewish and democratic is for there to be two states. And so if we care about that fundamentally, we need to help Israel and the Israeli government understand that the security situation on the ground is not tenable, the status quo is not tenable, and we need to make sure that we are doing the work to help get them where we think they need to and should be. And I think the reason the US has such a significant role to play in this is because we are Israel's greatest ally. We can put pressure on them that nobody else can. And also, when you love your friends, sometimes you need to tell them, hey, what you're doing is really self-destructive, or like it's not going to help you in the long run. And we all say this to our friends and family who we love. And it is okay for the US to say to Israel, hey, the occupation is actually a really serious security threat that leads to the kind of cycles of violence where people get killed all the time. We don't want to see more violence. We want everybody to be safe and secure. And there is a role that for the Israeli government to play in trying to limit that. And so there's a real role for the US to play in that. Also, obviously, you know, the US has a significant role to play in helping to get the Palestinian side into shape as well, which is like a whole separate topic, but very relevant. So the US has a unique role to play in pushing both the Israelis and Palestinians, even if they don't necessarily want to be pushed, because we care. And I think that that is why J Street, we identified the very first adjective that we use when we talk about ourselves is pro-Israel, because that is what we believe it means to be pro-Israel. And we believe also that Israel is a secure enough and strong enough country that they can handle a little criticism. And there are other people who would say that, you know, Israel can do no wrong. And if you say anything critical, then that means you're anti-Israel. So it's a bit of a complicated question, Linda, but I'm glad you brought it up. Yes.
I remember them. I have two questions. One on the two-state solution. Wondered if you could address J Street's approach to how that's accomplished. Where's that line drawn, and how much of it involves moving populations? And the second question I have, very different, was, it was the main question I had. You can come back. Yeah, we'll have to come back. No worries, Rich.
So I'm not going to be, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The situation on the ground is not looking good. Nobody is pretending that we are about to have a two-state solution tomorrow or next week or next month. What I will say is that the parameters for what a two-state solution would roughly look like have been pretty much agreed upon by the international community for the last few decades. So that would include, so that's borders based roughly on the 1967 borders. There will have to be some land swaps because some of the settlements in the West Bank are very developed, and it just logistically doesn't make sense to move all those people. But some of the farther outposts probably will have to be moved. We've evacuated settlements before it was done. So there will be, some land swaps. Jerusalem will have to be shared or have some shared jurisdiction in some way. But generally, the international consensus has been pretty consistent. In terms of what do we actually do to get there and how far we are away, I think for a lot of folks, we probably felt, when with John Kerry, that we were actually close for the first time and there was some progress. But really, since 2014, the situation has gone downhill for a number of reasons. And I think there's both, the Israeli government has become much more right-wing and has really ramped up the construction of settlements in ways that are very damaging to exactly what you said, because the more people who live in settlements, the harder it is to draw these borders or have a contiguous Palestinian state. They keep trying to develop them in very sensitive areas and make, a future Palestinian state much more like Swiss cheesy. So the Israeli government has really kind of pushed the envelope on that. At the same time, the Palestinian Authority has almost totally collapsed. They have basically no authority. They haven't had elections in 15 years. Abbas has basically has an 8% approval rating and is frankly very, very old and not in good health, and has no apparent succession plan. So there's a real concern that the Palestinian Authority has lost a ton of legitimacy and that it's not really clear who the successor would be, and there are different factions, and so there's really not a lot of incentive on either the Israeli side or the Palestinian side to help come to the table and try to come to an agreement. So there's no movement on either of those sides. And then under the Trump administration, the US wasn't doing very much either. They basically gave it to Jared and said, Jared, you're an expert on Middle East policy, go fix it. And perhaps shockingly, that didn't fix it. But so there was a real power vacuum for a few years, and I think we're very much seeing the repercussions of that. And so what I would say the US goal is right now should be is a few things. One, to build upon some of the very exciting diplomatic progress that's been made over the last few years with the Abraham Accords, and helping Israel develop better ties with their Arab neighbors. That's good. Helping to build upon that. Two, as part of that, trying to include the Palestinians in that regional integration. Three, trying to preserve the conditions for peace on the ground one day. And so what that means is we're saying we know that a deal is not close or soon, but we want to make sure one will still be possible one day. And so what that means is trying to limit settlement expansion, trying to prevent any unilateral annexation of the West Bank by Israel, which is something Netanyahu has talked very explicitly about. And if he becomes prime minister again, is definitely something he could talk about more seriously. Trying to empower people-to-people programs on the ground and support moderates on both sides. So there is a lot of work to be done. The situation is not hopeless at all. It's very long-term work and very long-term thinking. And I do think that the US has a very critical role to play in each of the three pieces that I mentioned above. So I hope that wasn't too depressing of an answer. Okay, so I want to address Susan's question. And address, okay, and then Seth's as well. So Susan's question, I don't think it means that, and I'll tell you why, because of the polling that I mentioned. So when we poll the American Jewish community, and we're going to do another one this year, so that'll be out, it'll be out in 2.5 weeks, so you'll get the updated numbers, but you can see last year's and all of them on the website. We polled the American Jewish community, and we asked people, what do you think being pro-Israel means you can criticize the Israeli government? Do you think being pro-Israel means you can oppose settlement construction, things like this? And we see, overwhelmingly, for 15 years, a majority of American Jews believe that it is okay to put pressure on both the Israelis and Palestinians. They believe that being pro-Israel means that you can criticize the Israeli government. They oppose additional settlement construction. They believe in roughly the contours of the two-state solution that I outlined. And again, we've seen that they support the Iran deal. So we've seen that for a decade of polling. So my understanding is that this actually is where most, that this actually is where the majority of the community is, as opposed to how they're seen. But I do think that, again, people who have more of the Israel can do no wrong pro-Israel view are, again, the ones who are loudest. And so there's that perception of where the community is and how they define that term. And Emily, just to address your poll and clarify, the polls that we do, and I say we do polls, we use a legitimate polling firm, GBAO, which is one of the top 5 pollsters in Democratic politics. So we don't self-select people. We I don't know how they do it, but they do it professionally and actually get representative sample sizes. So I actually do trust that it's, of American Jews, a relatively representative sample, as opposed to just my friends that I asked on the street. I see that Seth asked about our PAC and how it's different than APAC. So let me just say a quick word about this. So J Street's PAC is a conduit PAC, which is a little bit of an old-fashioned method of fundraising, which means that we bundle individual contributions for members. So say you want to give money to Jamie Raskin, you're like, I love him, he's my guy. I'm just going to do it through J Street, so he knows that I also care about J Street. And so what we do is we get all these individual contributions, and then once a week, we basically send the campaign a big check, and we say, here's all of the people who gave you money. So it is just your regular individual donation, the same as if you did it through Act Blue, except that you're also saying, by the way, I also am a J Street Jew, and I also care about J Street. So that is the kind of PAC that we have had for the last few decades. And until last cycle, it was the largest pro-Israel PAC, and we moved, as I mentioned, a few $1 million. So that is basically what we did. A considerable sum of money, nothing to sway an election one way or the other with the amount of money we see in politics right now. Bless you. So that is our regular PAC. And then the other one, which APAC also has, and they give regular money. The other kind of PAC that I mentioned is a super PAC, and that is what you use for independent expenditures when you're seeing, oh, this group spent $5 million or $10 million. If you see a number that big, that's a super PAC. And that is the kind of the independent expenditure group that I talked about before. J Street also has a super PAC. We spent $2 million in total this election cycle. I think APAC spent $2 million in 3 hours. So it's different scales. And the reason we had launched our super PAC, which actually preempted APAC's announcement, was because we were starting to see the trends of Democrats getting attacked in their primary elections for being anti-Israel. And that is the number one thing that we want to prevent, is people feeling, again, too afraid to say something like, I think we maybe shouldn't expand the settlements, and then getting slapped down and not reelected. If they're too afraid to say that, we won't have any policy change. So we saw that trend starting to happen, so we launched our super PAC to try to defend them. And then APAC announced their super PAC, and they just, frankly, they have a lot of money. APAC spent in 4 months, they became the single largest spender in American politics across all issues. It's, I think, a real question for our democracy. How much do we want to allow any one group on any issue to spend this much money in a primary election? And I also think, I assume most of you are very politically engaged, but most people are not paying attention in the primaries. They're like, oh, the election is in 6 months. Oh, the election is in 9 months. They are not paying attention. And those races tend to be a lot cheaper. And so to have a group come in and in 3 weeks spend $6 million, it changes the race. And when you're running in a safe Democratic seat, the person who's elected there could be in Congress for 30 years. It really matters. And these primary elections really can fly under the radar of some voters. And so so that's the difference in the structure and how they're used. And I think, I don't want to be, it's a little bit of, I'm not making a very clear moral argument, because we're doing the same work essentially, but I think the goal needs to be clear. What we want is an open forum of communication and debate on complex policy ideas. You don't have to agree with J Street 100%. We would never want that. We just want people to be able to have honest conversations about tough issues. And if people are afraid to have those conversations, we're never going to get anywhere policy-wise. And so that's what we're spending money on to try to defend. And I think AIPAC is spending money to try to shut that down. And so I do think the goals are really different. Obviously, like in my personal capacity, I think we shouldn't, like nobody should ever spend this much money in elections. I think it's really gross and scary. If I need to find a new job, but that would be okay. But I do think that that is, so I just wanted to make that distinction.
It's still a two-part question, but it's on the same topic. So this, I'm wondering if there are candidates that actually AIPAC and J Street in common support. I imagine they are, but you needn't put your money there. And then the second thing is J Street support outside of the American Jewish community. Are there other groups that support J Street? I'm sure there are other groups out there that think like J Street might, but do they actually recognize it and support J Street actively?
Sure. So on the first question, yes, there's a ton of overlap. As you can imagine, when you look at the policy things that like J Street and AIPAC support, there's like a big, the Venn diagram is like a big middle. So there's a lot of members of Congress that we overlap with, which again, is fine. We're all, like, I understand you're running for office. I understand you need support from all corners. Again, we would never want to shut the door to somebody by saying, well, you work with them, so we can't work with you. Like, that's really not what we want to do. We want to be a resource and help work with people and see if we can agree on something, and have it be an open conversation. So there's plenty of overlap. I'd say like maybe 40% of our endorsed members of Congress. So it's a good chunk. In terms of the second question you asked, which is what does our support look like? So we identify as a predominantly Jewish organization. So most of our supporters are Jewish, and we really do want to be a voice for a segment of the American Jewish community. I don't want to be too prescriptive. I think it's the majority, but I don't want to be too prescriptive. We do have supporters who are Palestinian, some. We have supporters who are Christian evangelicals, some, but it's mostly a Jewish organization. We also, in addition to the synagogue program, which Alan mentioned about, we also have chapters across the country. I think we have about 200,000 members. We have chapters on 70 college campuses across the country, and we have a student arm called J Street U. So that's mostly the space that we work in. Linda, the question, toughest question. Linda says, how do we reconcile the 20% of Jews who support a party that is entwined with white supremacy and misogyny? So I will give a half answer to this, which is that, as we all know, American Jews are not a monolith, and we all have very different opinions. And so, you know, there are some people who either, whether they're saying Israel is my number one voting issue and I'm only going to vote based on my definition of pro-Israel, which is being completely uncritical towards the government, or there are people who say, I actually don't vote on Israel, but I really like the Republican Party and what it stands for. People have different opinions. So that's really all I can say about that. What I will say just on this thread is that, again, our J Street primarily works on an issue set that is, related to Israel-Palestine issues. In this political moment, we are doing a lot more broader coalition work on democracy, which is why you're hearing me use like we and Democrat like very interchangeably, even though we're a nonpartisan organization, is just, it's very clear what the threats to US politics are, and we care about that both as an organization that operates in the American political system if it doesn't exist. Again, we all have to go home, but also as citizens who are really scared and we've seen this kind of rhetoric before, and we've seen it. And so it's very clear to us what side we need to be on in this fight in this year. And so we do a lot more coalition work, not leading, following people who are experts, but on voter protection, democracy, like rising white nationalism and anti-Semitism, and these are all things that are extremely concerning that we talk about a lot as well.
Can you say more about what that work looks like, the coalition work or the democracy work, on a kind of practical levels, and how, I'd be interested to know more of the process by which J Street kind of began to make that pivot in the thinking and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of, well, I'll talk about how we got there first. So we really have tried to stay very focused on our mission as an organization. I'm sure many of you are involved with lots of nonprofits, and there has been over the last few years what I would call like a nonprofit slide where everybody kind of does everything, which I'm not being critical, that's fine. But we've really tried to stay very focused on our specific mission. And what changed was Trump was elected. And so at that point, we started to say, well, there are a lot of issues that are really present right now that really speak to our Jewish values of, again, xenophobia, refugee issues, rising anti-Semitism, and far-right extremism. And so we started to do a little bit of work and be involved with those. And then in the 2020 election, we started to talk more about democracy and voting rights and that piece of the puzzle. What that looks like and what we actually do is simply that we join other groups in supporting and pushing for legislation on those issues. So we don't write those bills, but if somebody comes to us and says, hey, we've got a bill on refugees, or we think, the FBI should look into this on far-right extremism, we will lend our name to it and ask members of Congress to support it and say, hey, we wanted to let you know that we support this. And the other thing that this does is it really opens a door with members of Congress who maybe don't know as much about Israel or care. And it opens the door for us to begin working together, and for them also to see that again, the community cares about a lot of different things, and help build that relationship going forward.
I want to turn back to your comments earlier about polling. One of the questions that I had here is that polling averages right now show that both chambers are very close. And there's been a lot of hand-wringing over polling inaccuracies in the last few elections. So how does this influence your election predictions?
So I know that polling is a bit of a sore subject amongst folks who have seen this roller coaster before. Here's what I will say that I think is a good reminder. One is that polling has, and people in the polling community have really adjusted from 2016 and 2020, where they really overstated and overpredicted Democratic success in a lot of different areas. But one of the things that we see is that really tight polls, where it's within the margin of error, if it's a very close election, that really can be the difference. And so if a poll says consistently that, I'll say like John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, who's running for the Senate against Dr. Oz, who's the Republican candidate. John Fetterman is somebody who's been leading in the polls really significantly for the last few months, sometimes leading by like 10 points. Pennsylvania is a really close state. This is not going to be an election that's going to be won by 10 points. It might be won by 3 points or 1. And so when that polling gap narrows and you're still seeing, oh, Fetterman is, leading by 2, that means it's going to be very close. And there are many things that could impact ultimately how it turns out. So I think what I would say about polling is to look both at trends over time and also momentum, which is a bit of, which is one of the things that doesn't make statistical sense, but is really important in politics, is the momentum of people going into election day, or even the perceived momentum. And so if you start to see someone trending down, even if they've been polling ahead, it's helpful to kind of imagine that through election day. What I would say about polls is that they're helpful. They're one metric. I think we don't need polls to tell us that this is a very close election cycle. There is still much work to be done. If you feel like, canvassing in Virginia or somewhere else nearby, there's plenty of work to be done. I do think that the Senate will be very close. It's considered a toss-up. And I think Democrats will have to work very hard to hold on to the House. Oh, yeah, sorry. J Street, you agree challenges for, yes, so I am not an expert on this because I don't work with students, but I will just say that this comment is exactly right. I think we all know how being pro-Israel is perceived on most college campuses right now, which is exactly why we want to have J Street U there. And I'll just be very frank that one of the challenges that we have with students is that they get a lot of pressure for being seen as pro-Israel. And if they tend to be like a little bit more left in their politics, and our students do tend to be more on the progressive side of J Street in general, like domestic politics, there's a lot of pressure for them to go to more left-leaning groups. J Street is a center-left organization, and so students on campus feel a lot of pressure to join like JVP or a farther left group. And so I think that our work there is really critical because we're holding that middle voice where, again, you have students who can be pro-Israel and also identify as progressives on campus, and that is a huge part of the work. A lot of the stuff that they work on is very, very, very local and like very specific to the campus politics of the moment, what speaker was invited or not invited, or like, and so it's very local, and I think that the work that they do there is so important, and I hope that we can grow, we really want to grow that generation into a generation of Israel supporters, as opposed to losing them because of the pressure they get on campus. And if you are more interested in that, I will definitely connect you with my colleagues who work with our students more closely, because it's a really important piece of our work.
Does J Street deal with the issue of the boycott? So will you have a position on that, and how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, so we oppose the BDS movement. There are elements of it that are really anti-Semitic, and we also just don't agree with it tactically. Like, we don't think that economic pressure is the way to get to a two-state solution and the occupation. We think the parties need to sit down together and have serious peace talks. That being said, the concerning part for me is how elements of the US government at both federal and state and local levels have started to penalize people who participate in the BDS movement. And that's very concerning for us as a First Amendment issue. If you're an American, you have a First Amendment right to participate in a boycott, even if I don't agree with what you're boycotting or the movement, that is your First Amendment right. And so it's very concerning when, say, like a state like Texas passes a law that says like teachers who are public employees have to sign in their contract that they won't participate in this movement, and if they do, they get fired. That doesn't make sense. And so that is the part that's concerning for us. And there is actually, there is a court case that is being appealed to the Supreme Court right now. I think it just went up for appeal on Thursday, about an Arkansas newspaper and the BDS movement specifically. So that will be very interesting to watch. But so the short answer is we oppose the movement, but one of the concerning parts is how elements of the US government are responding. Yes.
We've got a similar issue right now in Montgomery County with the county council voting probably tomorrow or maybe Tuesday on, they want to take the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and codify it into law instead of just using it as examples. And I work with Jews United for Justice to try to defeat that very strongly. And we've got the JCRC working on the other side, and it's the same type of issue. They're penalizing people for something that they shouldn't be penalized for.
I've read this, and I can't be sure it's absolutely true, but I understand at the University of California at Berkeley, there were 10 student organizations that said anyone that identified with Israel or Judaism could not speak at any of their, and you seem to know.
Yeah, no, I'm sure folks have seen this in the news, maybe, and if not, I'll just kind of recap. And this is an unfortunate case of like one very bad headline. So what actually happened was some groups on campus tried to circulate a petition saying that nobody would invite speakers who supported Israel or something like that. And of like 110 student groups, 10 of them signed it, and the rest of them said, no, this is stupid. And this was about 2 years ago, and then it just died, and no one talked about it again, and it didn't affect any speaker who was invited or not invited. And then it got picked up, and somebody wrote an article about it with the headline like Berkeley is like a safe space for no Jews or something like that. So as you can imagine, so one of my colleagues on the political team, our PAC manager, she went to Berkeley, and her family's from Sacramento, and so she was very involved in all of this, and our student chapter at Berkeley was very involved in all of this. And so what I'll just say is that these issues are very live on campus, and we try to weigh in on them where appropriate, but mostly, again, defer to like the local conversation and what's most relevant for the chapter. But if folks are especially interested in that, there's an article I can send you after that I think is very helpful. So, Seth, tell me if I'm understanding your question correctly. So this is, why would we not oppose people AIPAC are supporting who are election deniers?
The question is,
Unfortunately, we can't hear you, and I don't know how to fix the audio, which is not great, so I'm sorry about that. Am I close or not close?
I don't understand them either.
Okay. Okay, Karen's calling you.
You want to call me or do the question?
Okay.
How old-fashioned using the telephone?
Oh, am I calling him? Yes. Wait a minute, Seth, I gotta put you on speaker. I'm gonna give it to you. Maybe you'll hear it. Oh, we can't do that because we're having an echo. You want to take his question? Sure.
Okay, got it, thank you. Good fix. So the question is, as J Street has grown and we've started to talk about, broader issues within the progressive tent in American politics, why haven't we also moved this focus to supporting the progressive movement in Israel? Which is a great question. And the short answer is that we are an advocacy group that focuses on American politics, and we actually don't do very much work in Israel on the ground. And the second part of that answer is that we do have an Israel office, and we do have a lot of partnerships with Israeli groups. And I really should have brought some brochures, because there's a great part of the J Street website that's called Our Israel that features Israeli groups across the country, across Israel, that we work with really closely and lift up their human rights work and their progressive movement. So we both have close allies within with some of the left parties in Israel, many of whom will be at the J Street conference, if either in person or on video, depending on how their elections go. And we also do lift up the voices of domestic progressive groups in Israel. So the short answer is that we do kind of, but not really, because we focus on American politics. And Seth is gone, so I hope that answered his question. Yes, the conference is December 3rd through 6th. It's at the Omni in DC. So Jamie Raskin is opening night on Saturday. There's programming Sunday and Monday all day, which is hybrid. And then Tuesday, we all go to the Hill for Advocacy Day, and you meet with your members of Congress and chat with them about foreign policy. And it'll be great. And I think it'll be really interesting because it'll be right after the Israeli and the US elections. So there's going to be a lot of strategizing over where we go from here.
What is your most effective strategy? Is it talking to congressmen? Is it writing postcards? Is it getting money?
So the number one most effective strategy that we have for influencing members of Congress is taking them to the region. So we run congressional delegations, which are trips for members of Congress, and staff delegations, which are for their staff. We have done 4 in the last year. And these are the absolute best way to build a relationship with someone, have them trust you, and also educate them. We consider our trips to be like a 201, like a graduate level seminar. We work them to death. It's a very packed schedule, and we have them meet with really all sides. So they meet with members of the Knesset in both the governing and the opposition coalitions. They meet with the kind of NGOs that do work. They meet with Palestinians, they meet with settlers, they meet with the IDF, they meet with everyone. And I think that they really come away from it understanding how complicated and how urgent it is. And so much of the feedback we get from members is, wow, like there are lobbyists in my office every single day talking about this, and it's all like one line, oh, you need to support the MOU. But it's missing so much of the gravity of the situation. So that is the number one way that we do that. And then again, bringing their staff to help them understand just the policy complexities is really helpful as well. And we also, some J Street leaders, which is what we call our lay people who are involved in our work, go on those trips as well. And so they become very close with members of Congress and keep those relationships for a long time. The trips are very, very emotional.
So let's turn back then to the threats to democracy in our election cycle right now, including hundreds of election deniers on the ballot. What are the different ways that our democracy is being attacked, and what can we do to help defend it?
Sure. So there's a lot of different pressure points in American politics right now. One is over 300 election deniers running for office at different levels. One is attacks on poll workers and election officials and threats against them. One is intensive misinformation for people when they go to try to vote. One is, poll watchers who are trying to intimidate people. So there's a lot of different levels before you even get to Congress and what the oversight looks like to actually confirm election results. So there's a lot to pay attention to and to be aware of. And I think the role that we all have as citizens is both to really just, vote, which is, easy check, but talk to the people we know, make sure they understand all the different pressure points, where their information is coming from, and how we can work together as citizens to help, verify results, have faith in systems as they're being reported. If we feel comfortable being poll watchers to help people, like these are the kinds of local things we can do that really make an impact. But I think that, it is really scary. And I think, we made it through the 2020 election because of the, moral stances of a few key figures. And I don't know that will happen again. I think the modern day Republican Party has made it very clear what their litmus test is, and they have spent the last 2 years pushing out everybody who doesn't agree with that. And so there's really a lot to be concerned about, and there's a lot to pay attention to. And there are a lot of groups, again, J Street doesn't lead on this, but there are a lot of groups who do this work in much more specific detail, who bring lawsuits, who help train election workers, and supporting those groups where possible is really important.
I want to add also to be vigilant in who you're voting for. We have people in Maryland who are election deniers and running in races, and then you have people like Board of Education, I'm sorry, very, very I mean, they don't come out as Republicans or Democrats, but they say things to hide their true nature. You really got to dig deep at who is funding these Board of Education candidates, and it's happening in our counties that we think are so liberal. And if you're not vigilant and you aren't careful who you vote for and spread the word, and anybody in Montgomery County, please contact me about Board of Education.
And Howard County, too.
Oh, yes, Howard too.
Major issues, yeah. What about the move of the U.S. Embassy from, well,
Yeah. So one of the things the Trump administration did that they get to claim as being like the most pro-Israel thing ever is they moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This was in 2017. We opposed the move at the time only because Jerusalem is such a thorny final status issue that in our view, the status of Jerusalem is something that should be decided as part of a larger peace process and not just the U.S. unilaterally saying, yeah, we're going to recognize this. So we disagreed with it in that sense. It doesn't change very much materially on the ground. I don't think there's really anybody saying we should move the embassy back. It's again just more keeping the whole peace process in mind and how influential the U.S. can be in saying, in pushing for certain things over another. And again, just trying to push Israel towards the path of saying, hey, you really need to have peace talks again. And how can we get you there so that we can resolve this conflict?
Okay. Any other questions? So I had one more question here about values of the American Jewish community, but I think you've addressed those, that topic already. So are there other questions? Anyone on Zoom? No? Okay. Anyone else here want to add anything else? So do you have some closing?
Yeah, I'll just say again, thank you all for coming out. These are really serious and important issues, and I'm really grateful for you spending the time to talk with me. I know I mentioned a lot of things that I said I would follow up with, so I'll just send them all to you, and then you can send it to this group. I would love to see you all at the conference if you're there. I think we have both very exciting main stage speakers and more intimate conversations like these, and it can be a good way to meet other J Street curious people in the region. So I hope to see all of you there, and for the virtual folks, it's hybrid as well. And I do think we try to do a good job integrating those, the online folks as well. So just thank you. Thank you so much for all the work that you do locally and nationally.
I just want to also say thank you very much, Laura. This was, I think, a really, really interesting, a lot of great insight for us, certainly more for us to discuss. And if anyone is interested in the conference, remember we have a 20% code that they've offered to us, OSE Shalom 2022. And I want to thank you again. Thank everyone. You made this really easy for me because you're all just really, really great, great discussion, really robust. Rabbi Josh, do you want to add anything or nothing? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.